Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on our 13th annual State of the Treasury Profession webinar. We'd especially like to thank everybody who took the online survey and those that participated in the interviews. A couple of housekeeping points. We're going to do this in 30 minutes. We will take questions, but have to respond in writing because we have a lot to cover in 30 minutes. We will distribute this deck to all attendees, and we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website so you can refer to it later. So today I am joined by my co-lead, Paul LaRock.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining.
We'll be discussing the findings of our survey, interviews, and market research. You can see the agenda. We're going to talk about some current market forces that are impacting Treasury, survey results, what Treasuries are focused on in 2019, and then what's next.
So as we did the interviews with our treasurers, we brought out and they communicated to us some strategic level forces that are affecting directly or indirectly the Treasury departments. And the first are geopolitical factors, specifically Brexit, trade wars, and central bank interventions. One of the outcomes of various central bank policies is a large interest rate differential between borrowing costs in the United States and those in foreign countries, specifically Japan and Europe. And that in turn leads to differences in these interest rates and access to credit. The access to credit discussion with treasurers was interesting. 1 out of 4 believe there will be a tightening of credit and a raising of interest rates in the latter part of 2019. Some being so specific as to say they think it's going to happen in the fourth quarter and go into the first quarter of 2020. The next major impact on Treasury from forces out of the control of Treasury departments is the strength of the U.S. economy and a labor market that is near full employment. And that's a good news, bad news thing. The good news about near full employment is rising incomes, help rising revenue lines on corporations. That's a good thing. For Treasury departments, we are in a small profession. And so to the extent there's rapid hiring by a large number of companies, they exhaust the available labor supply. And across the board, Treasury departments tell us that they're having problems hiring experienced Treasury staff, specifically in the 3 to 5 year experience area. There's also a surprising number of treasurers have recession concerns in the latter part of 2019, which dovetails with their ideas that there'll be a tightening of credit and a raising of interest rates.
Yeah, Paul, they said nothing's certain. We're in a pretty good time right now. A lot of money is being spent on a lot of different things, and organizations seem to be getting around to items that have been on their to-do list for quite a while. They're saying, it is our responsibility to have a game plan in place in case this happens. So I guess what was it? They felt that after 10 plus years of a growing economy,
we're getting into record-setting territory here. And I think that might be just a little bit of wisdom from those very experienced in the field that it's very unusual for an economic growth to go on so consistently for so long, and that it's just getting almost too good to be true, but good for all of us for now.
Yes. So, and then tax code changes have had impacts. And we'll talk about what those impacts are.
Yeah, and so there's 2 that really come to the forefront of treasurers. The first is a reduction in corporate tax rates, which leads to higher after-tax income. I think that is a primary driver of record-setting stock buybacks in 2018, going north of $1 trillion in a single year. The second is changes in the extent of deductibility of corporate interest expense, tying it to a ratio of EBITDA. That did not affect many investment-grade corporations. Affected some companies are below investment grade, but as the years go on, that will affect more companies. And if there was a recession and EBITDA was to dramatically increase across many companies and many industries, there would be a reduction in the deductibility of interest. And some of them have that in mind as they think about, in fourth quarter, next year, maybe first quarter, if the economy were to slow down, that's a point of reference for interest rate deductibility.
Right. And we're also seeing, because some of those were really plays were put in place last year, taken advantage of. We're seeing in 19 organizations still getting benefits, call it a long tail. They're looking at things like, well, we now have better access to global liquidity, and we're looking at ways of applying that. And you will see in the coming slides, the treasurers are talking about leveraging liquidity, optimizing the liquidity, and working capital.
Yeah, and we had several treasurers mention that they are intentionally borrowing more in Europe, taking advantage of those low interest rates, and intentionally borrowing less in the United States to avoid the higher interest rates in their borrowing. And those specific companies have global assets in such a structure that they do not significantly increase their foreign exchange risk in doing that. Other companies, different type of balance sheet, different spread of assets across the globe, they would have a foreign exchange risk management issue with that, but some companies can get away with that.
Yep. Then the next one we're very pleased to hear about, because I see this as a positive, is that a lot of companies have been engaging in mergers and acquisitions, and a few have been dealing with divestitures to expand the value of their organizations. And recently, I guess General Electric is the one I read about most recently. But on the M&A front, Treasury have a lot of, call it, digesting to do after the M&A activities occur, and we heard a lot of treasurers talking about that, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well.
And now the bad news.
Now the bad news.
Yeah.
So the fraud attempts, the bad actors in the world are continue to become more sophisticated, to elevate their attempts. We'll talk about that quite a bit. This is business as usual for Treasury. Fraud has been around a very long time, but some of the new attacks and attempts on Treasury are very, very sophisticated. And I think this is the one thing that everybody's interested in, whether it's Treasury or anywhere else in the company. And finally, the LIBOR replacement. And that could be a very, very significant issue. And we're hoping that some of the ideas like SOFR and some of the others are there, but several treasurers did mention this is something they're planning on, because you've got your credit, you've got a lot of things related to LIBOR that have to get switched out.
Yeah, so debt securities, lines of credit that reference the index of LIBOR, that has to be changed and adjusted. There have to be amendments to borrowings. And for those issuing new debt, if it's a variable rate, you have to pick an index. And, I think the default has usually been LIBOR. That will have to change in 2019 and 2020.
Okay, so next we're going to get into the results of our survey and our interviews. We performed an online survey out to many, many organizations. We got some really good feedback on that, and we have some historical data to compare that to. In addition, we interviewed a large number of treasurers and assistant treasurers, senior treasury people this year, and we really got some very interesting results from those conversations, and we think the two of them tied together nicely. So, with no further ado.
Okay. So what we did in our survey, treasurers had a choice of 65, it's multiple choice, 65 different things to choose from. The viewers are looking at the top 5. Working capital management and cash forecasting are always closely connected to one another. We make the comment that cash forecasting is the radar screen of corporate liquidity, and because working capital is a subcomponent of that liquidity, we see those closely connected to one another. Financial risk management, when the treasurers talk to us about it in the interviews, and we think what they're referring to in the survey is overwhelmingly around foreign exchange and interest rate risk management. The next was bank relationship management. And finally, Treasury staffing levels and skill sets, which complement the interviews where they were concerned about being able to hire the number of people at the experience levels that they were looking for. And I think the bank relationship management, as it's moved over time, always in the top 5, really relates to not just the relationship with the bank, but how many banks should you be dealing with? What is the structure of accounts and services? This is especially a top-of-mind issue for those who are integrating recent mergers. You've got these legacy bank accounts and bank relationships that you inherit from an acquisition.
Yeah, and I guess you pointed out here that Treasury Staffing and Skill Levels has popped up into the top 5 this year.
Yeah.
Okay, the second question we asked was, if you were to benchmark against your peers, what would you like to know? And you can see that comparing bank service fees has remained number 1 for the past several years. And then you can see that bank relationship, which Paul just talked about, we feel that that's a much broader category than just a relationship. You know, do we have the right accounts? Do we have the right fees? Do we have the right services? And of course, are we overpaying for those services? So that's something that it's a hard dollar savings if you can get it right. On the forecasting side, you know, people would like to know what their peers are doing. You can see that has moved up, and I have to say, forecasting is something we're going to see a lot of, and we'll talk about it some more later. Best practices, staffing and skill levels is still there, and we'll talk some more about that because it ties in with some work we did last year on optimizing your treasury and maximizing your use of technology.
And so when we did our interviews, we structured the interviews in 3 pieces. The first was to ask treasurers what are the opportunities that they see in 2019. The second is what are the risks they see in 2019. And when treasurers think about opportunities and risks, what then is it that you plan to do in 2019? So the remainder of our presentation is going to talk about those 3 categories.
Right, and we got a lot of great responses. Some of you listening will say, I gave them that one. These are not all of them. These were the top
half dozen
or so.
Yeah. So the most important thing that people mentioned to us in their minds was liquidity optimization. And treasurers talked to us usually about short-term liquidity, but they also talked about longer-term balance sheet liquidity, looking out a few years. I think that's where the forecasting, multi-year forecasting concerns or efforts were tied to. Subcomponent, of course, of liquidity is working capital, specifically accounts payable, accounts receivable, amount of inventory you're keeping. And so all of that kind of interconnects together. I think there's an interconnection between a lot of these things that is focused on improving the various subcomponents of the balance sheet and thinking about all of the costs associated with incoming and outgoing funds. One of the ways to improve that is using technology and automation capabilities. And Jeff, you had some interesting discussions around that.
Oh, yes, very much so. So there are a lot of exciting new technologies out there. Some of them are more mature than others. People are looking at them saying, how do I leverage them? And so they're looking at things like robotics, processing, artificial intelligence to protect against fraud, and also to gain insight into things like forecasting. Can you leverage artificial intelligence into forecasting, dashboarding, some other? So there is some exciting new capabilities, some exciting new software offerings, if we want to still call them that. But the other side of this is a lot of organizations are looking to optimize their existing investment in technology and their people. And we feel it's very important to combine those two because it's the people that drive the car at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And a lot of organizations feel that they've got some technology in place. It may not make sense to switch it out, but more important to maximize the use of it and harmonize all the multiple systems you've got.
Because it's frankly, like anything else, it's easier to buy technology than it is to implement it, right? And so it's a multi-month, multi-year effort to really get the value out of technology, whether you're talking about treasury technology, whether you're talking about ERP systems, risk management systems. I think that's consistently true. Another aspect of opportunities that treasurers raised with us was closer partnership with the business units. And so this is a strategic change for treasury departments, which traditionally have focused overwhelmingly on balance sheet management, liquidity management, both long-term and short-term. If they want to improve working capital, and they want to incorporate advanced technology and incoming, outgoing payments, by definition, they have to start working closely with the business units, because the business units face the vendors and they face the customers. And so to really do those projects well, it's all about the details, right? And so we're seeing a consultative approach to business units in more and more companies.
Yes, and on this one, it was a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
Your Treasury offering value to the organization. We talked to a lot of different organizations: insurance companies, manufacturing firms, healthcare. We talked to a grocery store chain, and it was a bi-directional benefit to the organization of Treasury, much more involved in working closely with the divisions.
Now, in terms of risk management, there's three elements of this. First of all, there's the interest rate and FX risk management, financial risk management, which we mentioned earlier. But and that really came out on the surveys. But in the interviews, treasurers are including in the bucket of risk management, payment and data risk management. So payment risk management is the concept of fraud, right? You don't want people debiting your accounts and stealing your money. You don't want employees utilizing your payment system to steal money. So that's kind of a payments fraud concept. The other aspect of that is protection of data. And so this is most prominent for those of you who are doing a lot of credit card processing. You may have heard the term payment card industry, data security standards, PCI DSS, but also the integrity and protection of bank account data for vendors, for customers. And so the protection of all of that is of increasing concern. We've done a number of projects where we've focused on security and protocol around changes in vendor databases. And so that's an initiative that was not 5 years ago. That wasn't such a big thing with Treasury departments. And now we're seeing lots more interest in that aspect of it.
Right. And this is one of those, several of these, which we'll get to, are things where they're both an opportunity and a risk situation. On the risk management side, I recall in several of the interviews, treasurers saying, we were hedging foreign exchange all along because it became volatile a couple of years ago. Now they're starting to look at other things, like I started hearing interest rate swaps again. I haven't heard interest rate swaps in many, many years.
Yeah.
One treasurer jokingly said, we actually have to educate some of our team on what it means when interest rates are above zero, because they've worked in Treasury their whole careers and have never seen interest rates over 3, 4, 5%.
Yeah.
So
that is kind of a mindset change. If you're somebody who's been in Treasury for less than 10 years, know that you're living in a historically unusual level of interest rates. Typically, they're several percentage points higher than they are now. For those who've been in the field for several decades, you know that there was a time where you would earn several percentage, 3, 4, 5% overnight in short-term money. That is like you'd have to go out and buy a 10 or 30-year bond now to do that. This is very unusual what's been going on for 10 years. At some point, we'll return to historical norms.
And the last item under opportunities that came up that we felt was just such a positive and big area for people to look at are all the new payment tools and opportunities. One organization was talking about how they were using Zelle, MasterCard Send. We're hearing PayPal. A lot of organizations are looking at what the new capabilities for payments are. And the other side of this is on the traditional forms. We are moving into real-time payments, real-time settlement, which is both a benefit and a risk.
Yeah. So you see that domestically, and a couple banks want to do that globally, internationally. One of the prominent U.S. banks has launched a product where they use blockchain technology to almost instantaneously move funds across international borders. That's a real game changer in like money transfer businesses and things like that. And it will be something that we'll have to observe and with interest as the years play out is, are those new products practical and are they scalable?
Yep. And now on to the risks. So we asked them what risks they felt, and interestingly, many of them said it's really just the other side of the coin from opportunity.
Right.
So the first and foremost by a mile was payment fraud and cyber risk. Almost everybody we talked to said, and you can't ignore risks without talking about this. And it has gotten so much more sophisticated. Organizations have put good processes in place, or I should say they haven't put them in place. They've improved the processes that they have in place, and they continue to improve them. And this is something that you have to continually keep an eye on because the exploits have gotten worse and worse. I was talking to one treasurer who told me that somebody had gotten inside their organization and was sending out the change of settlement instructions directly from people's actual email accounts. So it wasn't a spoof email, it was a real email, and it was hidden in such a way that the people that were sending it didn't realize they were sending it out. So these activities have gotten very, very high. And this is the one where I believe one treasurer said to me, this is the thing where I'm going to get pulled in front of the board, and it's the conversation I absolutely don't want to have with the board.
Yeah.
So this is number one.
Yeah. And so cyber risk around data at rest, I think the best example is what's happened with the credit card breaches, which largely consists not of the typical credit card fraud that's been around forever. I steal my neighbor's card, I buy a $50 product and don't pay it, but rather stealing huge blocks of card numbers, which are then subsequently turned into new credit cards and sold to criminals. That has destroyed people's careers at the organizations where that's happened. And I think everybody is, having a hope that's not me, and they're acting on that by reviewing the security around the databases that control that private information.
Yep. And of course, there's bundled in with this is denial of service attacks against the financial institutions you need to leverage. I was talking to somebody the other day. They claimed it was a fire at Wells Fargo, but they were unable to move money. The bank was unable to move money. The next day on Friday, multiple accounts were withdrawn. That was not a good situation.
Yeah, and the source of that inability to move money is really access to data. People could not see their balances and therefore did not know how much to move in order to manage their cash.
The next item was people. And, this is, again, it was a great thing that it's very low unemployment rate, very high level of employment. But, treasurers are focused on how to retain people, how to hire good people because the pool is getting thinner and thinner, how to motivate your existing team, how to train them, how to upgrade the capabilities of your organization, and how to maximize the value that the organization is getting from people. We did a study last year at the use of technology, and what we found was, even though technology gave some control, they weren't realizing the efficiencies they wanted. They weren't getting people to do, we hire a bunch of MBAs to really be able to do some fantastic things, and they're spending their time figuring out where our cash is. That's not value add.
Right.
Automation should be able to take care of that.
And around volatility, continuing with this theme, kind of a two-edged sword or two sides of the same coin, are low interest rates good or bad? Well, low interest rates are not good for you if you're investing money, but they're kind of nice if you're borrowing money. A strong euro isn't good for you if you're trying to export out of Europe, but it's nice if you have sales in Europe when you convert those euro sales on your income statement to US dollars. That gives you an earnings boost. And so you have this kind of good news, bad news aspect with volatility. There's going to be winners and losers. And some companies can find some part of their company winning, another part losing in the same company based on changes in interest rates as well as foreign exchange movements.
Yes, very much so. Then we move on to faster payments and rate of change in technology. So again, a benefit to faster payments, but also an awful lot of concern around, are we making the right technology investments? Are we betting on the right horse? That came up a couple of times.
Yeah, well, that's what the rate of change concept. And we heard a couple of treasurers say, we're investing in this. This is something going on in 2019. And they're pausing and reflecting, in 2022, we might regret this, but at some point, we've got to put a horse in the race in terms of technology and commit to this. We hope we're making the right choice.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah, and in regards to liquidity and access to capital, this echoes what we said earlier in terms of changing interest rates, tightening of capital possibly in the fourth quarter. And the geopolitical situation is something that treasurers don't control. They have to react to this. The thing that probably most impacts most treasurers is central bank changes in policy regarding interest rates.
Yep. It seems like Brexit's been planned for and prepared for, and hopefully it's not a hard Brexit, but it does seem like most treasurers we talk to are ready for it. Okay, so now we move on to what's on your to-do list. And we found this to be consistent with everything we've heard so far. And we're going to go through what your peers are working on. I hope that you find several of these are items that you are focused on. And if you have any questions, of course, we can.
Yeah. And so our to-do list, we've clustered things under three broad umbrellas, three themes that we see on the to-do list of treasurers around the country. And the first is around liquidity management. This is where you're going to find your working capital projects, your cash forecasting projects, the technology projects, which also relate to payment processing, better forecasting and efficiency. And the third is around people. So it's great to have really nice borrowing facilities, super to have state-of-the-art technology, but ultimately none of this stuff works unless you've got the professionals in place to operate it, right?
And a very nice follow-on to this is absolutely everybody listening to this webinar are the people we're talking about,
Yeah.
the treasurers are talking about.
Yeah.
So they're focused on you and your career development.
Yeah, there's probably more than a few treasurers listening to this this broadcast right now who are nodding as they're thinking about recruiting efforts in 2019.
Yep. So finally we get to the actual actions that people are talking about, where the rubber meets the road. Had to throw a car analogy in here.
Of
Although
course.
in a couple of years, those cars will probably be running on electric versus gas, but we'll get there.
Yeah. So around the theme of enhanced liquidity, forecasting being the radar screen of liquidity continues its traditional place as being one of the top things treasurers are concerned about. They want to improve it. They want to make it more efficient. We had 2, maybe 3 treasurers who were optimistic that artificial intelligence and robotics can be applied to their forecasting process in 2019. So they're kind of doing an experiment with that. They're pretty optimistic that that will work well. Then there is the leveraging of new technology to achieve higher levels of automation.
Yeah, we heard a lot of people talking about leveraging things like robotics processing and artificial intelligence, and they are the focus is we're not going to hire more people. We're going to be using technology to do what it's supposed to be doing, which is giving us higher levels of automation, which is efficiency, more visibility, and better control. And I think our next webinar is going to be on these new technologies. Then you get to optimizing your current team and technology. So a lot of organizations have finally gotten around to upgrading the technologies that they have in place. It's something that's been on the to-do list, and fortunately, they're finally at the point where they're doing it. So they're taking their existing systems, they're upgrading them, and they're looking to get more out of what they've got. So getting things to work together better. The team as well, which is key, right? You may have a car that can go 200 miles an hour, but if somebody's farsighted and they don't have corrective lenses, they can't drive it that fast. So you have to invest in the team. Those are the people that actually drive the technology to work. So it's very, very important to realize that aspect, the investment in the team and the training of the team and making sure that they're comfortable with the technology you're putting in place are the things you should be focusing on.
Technology interfaces are always important, but there is no more important interface than that between the humans and the machines. And I think that's what treasurers are really embracing and trying to work on. The next thing is around banking services, relationships, bank monitoring systems. So this is picking the right banks, right number of banks. How do you structure the account relationship, the account structures, and what services do you apply to those accounts? that is closely related. If you've gone through mergers and integrations, you bring in these other banking relationships and how to service the combined organization. How do you best work with your banks? What services do you deploy?
And on this one as well, we start touching on the protection, cyber controls, that sort of thing, because organizations are saying we need to really get our arms around all of our banking relationships and start minimizing interactions with them. We don't want people logging into systems. We also want to make sure that the fees we're being charged are correct. And there's a lot of focus on that as well. But getting a handle on who the signatories are, making sure you've got a platinum source database that talks about it, that's a big focus.
Yeah. When companies think about payment process improvements, cost reductions, and risk mitigation with that, they're frequently doing that within the context of working capital optimizations. In fact, the way I would define it is they're looking at the entire cash conversion cycle, and they're looking at the traditional working capital metrics of DPO, DSO, and DIO, but then complementing that with not just improving the numbers on the balance sheet, which helps liquidity and debt expense, but also the process that's associated with those. So you're going to say, look, we want to lower our DSO. That's a balance sheet concept. But the second thing that we're seeing treasurers say is, let's not only lower the DSO, let's also improve the efficiency of the processing of checks, ACH, card transactions, and especially card transactions. That's a rising cost for many companies. And so it's this integrated, holistic approach.
Right. And the other aspect of this next to last item, the payment process improvements, cost reductions, is risk mitigation. This is where the rubber meets the road for many Treasury departments on the cyber risk and fraud protections. We did a lot of work on this last year, right, Paul?
Mm-hmm. We did, and especially around controls associated with new payment processes and the automation. So when you change your tools, you change your risks, right?
Right.
You go from a hand drill to a power drill, different set of risks, different set of concerns. Same thing with payment processing.
And then, we heard a lot, and we've talked about the M&A support, both in the process of acquiring and then also the integration afterwards, the cleanup, as we like to say. Finally, on new payment tools and automation, organizations are looking at these. There are some fantastic new things being developed. And, I was having a conversation with one of the organizations that delivers these new capabilities, and they were saying the key here is integration. You're going to have APIs with banks. You're going to be able to communicate much, much better and get much richer information. And on the Treasury side, it's not just a strategy of how we're going to use it and what we're going to use. It's how you tie it in with your existing systems, and that's a big integration exercise. Okay. So, in wrap-up, we'd like to talk about what to expect next. We're doing our quarterly cash briefing. We'll be approaching that late March, so look for our announcements around that. And then we talked about the technology trends, where we've interviewed treasurers around the country to find out what their use cases are for robotics processing, for AI, for dashboarding, blockchain, and the like. So look for those. They'll be coming up shortly. Others will be announced later. And then on the conference side, we're pleased to announce that we've been selected to speak at all of the major regional conferences, Texpo, New England AFP, Windy City, of course the fantastic New York Cash Exchange, because I'm on the board there, so we have to plug that one, and National AFP. I think we're talking on items ranging from forecasting to cybersecurity and fraud, to a bunch of other areas.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. Have a good day and a great 2019.
Yes, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you, and have a great year.